Captain Harlan Brooks, thought he owned the sky. With decades in the left seat, he believed the cockpit was an exclusive boys' club, and he wasn't shy about making that known. So when he walked onto his Boeing 777 and saw a young black woman sitting in the co-pilot seat, his immediate reaction was pure, unfiltered disdain. He grabbed his phone, demanding a replacement, completely unaware that the quiet woman he was insulting wasn't a rookie. She was the FAA's chief flight examiner. The harsh fluorescent lights of Chicago O'Hare's Terminal 3 reflected off the gold bars on Captain Harlan Brooks's shoulders. In his 50s, Harlan was a relic of a bygone era of aviation. He walked with a heavy and swagger, his rolling flight bag clicking rhythmically against the polished terrazzo floors. To Harlan, flying wasn't a team effort. It was a dictatorship, and he was the undisputed king. He had flown for Global Continental Airlines for decades, transitioning from the military, where he flew fighters, to the sprawling flight decks of commercial heavy metal. Today's assignment was a heavy Boeing 777, bound for London Heathrow. It was a route Harlan could fly blindfolded, a long transatlantic hop over the ocean. He stopped by the crew dispatch room to pick up his paperwork and review the weather. Handing his badge to the dispatcher, a young man named Derek Hale, Harlan didn't even bother to make eye contact. "Morning, Harlan. Got your dispatch release right here," Derek said, sliding a thick stack of printed papers across the counter. "Looks like you have a last-minute schedule change for your first officer. Your usual guy called in sick. Food poisoning, I think." Harlan frowned, finally looking up. "Who did they stick me with, Derek? Don't tell me it's one of those kids fresh out of the right seat of a regional jet. I don't have the patience to babysit all the way to London." Derek glanced at his screen, looking slightly uncomfortable. No. Looks like a reserve pilot. E. Langford. I don't see a lot of hours on the line with us, but she's cleared for the 777. Harlan scoffed, snatching the papers. "She? Fantastic. Just what I need. Another diversity hire pushed through the system to make the corporate brochures look good. Thanks, Derek. I'll be sure to hold her hand during the crosswind landing." Harlan stormed out of dispatch, his blood already boiling. He hated the modern airline industry. He hated the new crew resource management protocols that forced him to treat his co-pilots as equals rather than subordinates. But mostly, he hated anyone who didn't fit his narrow, outdated mold of what a pilot should look like. When Harlan stepped through the heavy reinforced door of the 777's flight deck, the auxiliary power unit was already humming. The myriad of screens and instruments were lit up, bathing the cockpit in a soft, glowing light. And there, sitting in the right seat, was his new first officer. Elena Langford was in her 30s, but her calm, commanding presence made her seem far older. She was a black woman, with her hair pulled back into a neat professional bun, wearing a crisp white uniform shirt and the 3 stripes of a first officer. What Harlan didn't know, what absolutely nobody at Global Continental knew, was that Elena wasn't a reserve pilot at all. She was an undercover evaluator, the highest-ranking chief flight examiner for the Federal Aviation Administration in the region. She had been sent explicitly to conduct a random, unannounced line check on Global Continental senior captains, following a series of anonymous safety complaints regarding toxic cockpit culture. "Good evening, Captain," Elena said, her voice steady and polite, as Harlan threw his bag into the corner with unnecessary force. "I'm Elena Langford. I'll be your first officer tonight." Harlan didn't extend his hand. He didn't even offer a polite nod. He just stared at her, his eyes raking over her uniform as if searching for a flaw. "Langford," he grunted, sliding into the left seat and adjusting his headset. "Let's get one thing straight right now. I don't know who you know at corporate or what quota they were trying to fill when they put you in this seat, but my flight deck is not a training ground. You touch the radios when I tell you to. You run the checklists when I tell you to. And if things get hairy, you sit on your hands and let me fly the airplane. Understood? Elena didn't flinch. Her expression remained completely neutral. Inside, however, she was already filing a mental report. Hostile work environment, immediate breakdown of crew resource management, prejudicial bias. Understood, Captain, Elena replied evenly, returning her attention to the flight management computer. She had deliberately left one minor non-critical waypoint out of the routing, waiting to see if Harlan would catch it during his cross-check. Harlan settled into his seat, visibly agitated. Don't just say understood like a robot. How many hours do you even have in a wide body? 500? 1,000? Elena kept her eyes on the screen, her fingers dancing rapidly across the keypad. I have sufficient hours to be fully type-rated on the 777, Captain. It was a massive understatement. Elena had thousands of hours of flight time, had been a test pilot for Boeing, and had literally contributed to the revised safety manual for this exact aircraft. Right. Sufficient, Harlan muttered, shaking his head. He pulled out his phone and immediately drafted a text to his fleet manager. Got stuck with a diversity hire. E. Langford, no experience. If she screws up, I'm tossing her out of the cockpit. Just wanted it on record. He hit send, feeling a smug sense of satisfaction. He was establishing a paper trail, preparing to blame her for any minor inconvenience that might occur during the flight. What he didn't realize was that every word he spoke, every sigh of contempt, was being meticulously catalogued by the woman sitting less than 3 feet away from him. The boarding process began, the muffled sounds of hundreds of passengers shuffling down the jet bridge, bleeding into the cockpit. Harlan was furiously clicking through the overhead panel, snapping switches with a practiced, aggressive speed. He was moving too fast, relying purely on muscle memory rather than following the flow of the pre-flight checklist. This was a classic hallmark of complacency, a dangerous trait in aviation that Elena was explicitly trained to look for. The cockpit door chimed, and Lena Hart, the chief purser, stepped in. Lena was a seasoned flight attendant in her 40s, and she knew Harlan's reputation well. She offered a warm, somewhat apologetic smile to Elena. Evening, Captain Brooks. Evening, First Officer, Lena said, handing Harlan a cup of black coffee. Boarding is about halfway done. We're looking at a full house tonight. Harlan took the coffee without a word of thanks. Make sure they sit down fast, Lena. I want to push back early and keep the flight deck door locked tight tonight. I don't want any distractions. He shot a sideways glance at Elena. I'm already going to be working double time up here, managing the right seat. Lena's smile faltered. She looked at Elena, expecting to see embarrassment or anger, but Elena just gave Lena a reassuring, subtle nod. Understood, Captain, Lena said tightly, stepping back out and closing the heavy reinforced door behind her. All right, let's run the pre-flight checklist, Harlan barked, finally looking at the screens. You know how to read a checklist, right? Yes, Captain, Elena said smoothly, pulling up the electronic display. Pre-flight checklist. Oxygen, Harlan interrupted, not actually checking the gauge. Elena noted the deviation. Captain, the gauge shows sufficient pressure, but standard operating procedure requires a physical flow test. Harlan turned to her, his face turning a shade of crimson. Listen to me, Langford. I was flying these heavy jets when you were still in middle school. The oxygen was tested by maintenance hours ago. I don't need you quoting the manual at me. Just read the next item. Elena did not argue. She knew that arguing with a pilot of his temperament during a high workload phase was unproductive. Instead, she reached into her flight bag and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook, resting it on her kneeboard. She unclipped a silver pen and made a single precise check mark. Flight instruments, Elena continued, her voice devoid of any emotion. Set and checked, Harlan snapped. Parking brake, Elena read. Set. The routine continued, with Harlan rushing through the vital checks. eager to prove that he didn't need a first officer, let alone one he deemed beneath him. As they reached the final items on the list, a yellow advisory message illuminated on the engine, indicating and crew alerting system screen. It was a minor fault message regarding a redundant bleed air valve on the right engine. Elena tapped the screen. "Captain, we have a bleed air advisory on engine 2. It looks like a sensor fault. We should consult the minimum equipment list before we call for pushback." Harlan rolled his eyes, letting out an exaggerated groan. "It's a glitch. The 777 has 1,000,000 sensors, and half of them cry wolf. We have a redundant system. I'm not delaying this flight for an hour, so maintenance can come out here, scratch their heads, and reset a breaker. Clear the message. Captain, the FAA mandate and our company operations manual require us to verify any EICAS message against the MEL prior to pushback," Elena stated firmly. She wasn't just observing anymore. She was giving him a direct opportunity to correct a safety violation. Harlan leaned forward, pointing a thick, calloused finger just inches from Elena's face. "Let me explain something to you, sweetheart. I make the command decisions on this airplane. Not the FAA, not a book, and certainly not a green co-pilot who got her job through a diversity initiative. Clear the message." Elena held his gaze for 3 long seconds. The silence in the cockpit was deafening, save for the hum of the avionics cooling fans. She knew right then that Harlan Brooks's career was effectively over. It was no longer a question of if she would ground him, but when. She reached up and pressed the cancel button, clearing the yellow text from the screen. "Message cleared, Captain," Elena said softly. She clicked her pen again. "Willful violation of maintenance protocols, insubordination to safety mandates, aggressive intimidation tactics." That evening, the boarding doors were closed. The tug was attached to the nose gear, ready to push the massive aircraft away from the gate. Harlan picked up his radio mic, switching over to O'Hare ground control. "O'Hare ground, global flight heavy, ready for push and start at gate K-16. Global flight heavy, cleared for push and start, face east. Altimeter 29.92. The controller's voice crackled through the speakers. "Cleared for push, facing east. Global flight," Harlan replied. He turned off his microphone and looked at Elena. "All right, just sit there and watch how a real pilot handles this plane." The pushback was smooth. The massive engines roared to life one by one, shaking the floorboards of the flight deck with raw, controlled power. It was a dark, drizzly night in Chicago. The tarmac was a sea of blue and green taxi lights reflecting off the wet concrete. Navigating O'Hare at night required absolute concentration, which was exactly why the FAA enforced the sterile cockpit rule. Below 10,000 feet, and during all taxi operations, pilots were strictly forbidden from discussing anything other than the immediate operation of the aircraft. Harlan, however, felt the rules did not apply to him. As they taxied toward the runway, Harlan decided it was the perfect time to give Elena an unprompted lecture. "You know, the problem with this industry today is that it's gone soft," Harlan began, steering the tiller with his left hand, while keeping his right hand resting lazily on the thrust levers. "Used to be you had to earn this seat. You had to spend years flying cargo through thunderstorms before they even let you look at a passenger jet. Now they just fast-track people like you because the HR department wants a nice photo for their Instagram page." Elena was monitoring the taxiway center lines, cross-referencing their position on the airport diagram. "Captain, we are approaching taxiway November. Ground instructed us to hold short of November until the American flight passes." "I see the American," Harlan dismissed, not slowing down. "He's moving slow. I can easily make the crossing before he gets here." "Captain, we were instructed to hold short," Elena warned, her voice elevating slightly. This was a runway incursion waiting to happen. Harlan grunted, slamming on the toe brakes a bit too hard. The massive aircraft jerked to a halt, the nose gear compressing heavily. Through the rain-slicked windshield, the American flight rolled past them on the intersecting taxiway, a little closer than comfortable. "See? Plenty of room," Harlan muttered defensively. "You panic too easily. That's what happens when you lack real-world experience." Elena said nothing. She keyed her microphone. "O'Hare ground. Global Flight Heavy. We are holding Diabayou short at November. Global Flight Heavy, roger. Follow the American. Monitor tower on 120.9. Follow the American. Switching to tower 120.9. Global flight." Elena read back flawlessly. Harlan snorted. "Wow, you can read a radio frequency. They must have taught you that in your special fast-track academy." Elena ignored the jab. She dialed in the tower frequency. They were cleared for takeoff a few minutes later. As the 777 lined up on the center line of the runway, Harlan pushed the thrust levers forward. The immense power pinned them back in their seats as the aircraft hurtled down the runway, throwing up a massive spray of water behind them. "V1, Elena called out, marking the speed at which takeoff could no longer be aborted. "Rotate," she called a second later. Harlan pulled back on the yoke, and the heavy jet broke the surly bonds of Earth, climbing steeply into the dark, cloudy Chicago sky. The landing gear thumped heavily as it retracted into the belly of the plane. For the first portion of the climb, the workload was high, and Harlan was forced to focus on flying. But as soon as they passed 10,000 feet, the sterile cockpit rule ended. A chime echoed through the cabin, signaling to the flight attendants that they could begin their service. Harlan immediately reached up and hit the autopilot button. He leaned back in his seat, rubbing his eyes, and let out a long, dramatic sigh. "All right," Harlan said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You handled the radios well enough, I suppose. But let's be real, Langford. How did you actually get this gig? Did you sue somebody? Or did they just give you a free pass on the simulator checks?" Elena finally turned to look directly at him. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, and entirely unafraid. "I passed my simulator checks with perfect scores, Captain Brooks. I earned my type ratings the exact same way you did, through hours of study, practice, and check rides." Harlan laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Right. Sure you did. Look, I don't care what they told you at corporate, but up here, I'm the law. And frankly, I don't feel safe having someone with your background backing me up if an engine fails over the Atlantic." Before Elena could respond, Harlan leaned over to the center console and pulled up the aircraft communications addressing and reporting system. It was a digital data link system used to send text-based messages directly to the airline's dispatch and management teams on the ground. Harlan began typing furiously, not caring that Elena could see the screen. "To Chief Pilot, Global Continental. From Captain Brooks. Flight to London subject. Unacceptable foe. Assignment. Message. Currently climbing through flight level 220. My FOE Langford is dangerously inexperienced and entirely unsuited for this aircraft. It is obvious she is a diversity quota hire. Her presence compromises the safety of my flight deck. I am requesting she be immediately reassigned upon our arrival in London, and I expect a new first officer for my return flight. I refuse to fly with her again." Harlan hit send. The screen flashed, confirming the message was transmitted to the company's servers via satellite. It was now a permanent legal record. Harlan looked at Elena, a triumphant smirk on his face. "There, now it's on the record. If anything goes wrong tonight, it's on you and the idiots who hired you." Elena watched the transmission confirmation disappear from the screen. She felt a profound sense of pity for the man sitting next to her. He had just handed her a written confession of his own prejudice, filed on a company system, while actively commanding a commercial flight. "Yes, Captain," Elena said quietly, her voice smooth as silk. It is absolutely on the record. She reached for her kneeboard, unclipped her silver pen, and began to write. This wasn't just a line check anymore. This was about to be an execution. The Boeing 777 cruised seamlessly at 35,000 feet, cutting through the cold, thin air over the North Atlantic Ocean. The glow of the instrument panels bathed the cockpit in an eerie ambient light, casting long shadows across Captain Harlan Brooks's face. They were well into the flight, having just passed the coast of Newfoundland, entering the oceanic track system where radar coverage was sparse, and pilots relied on high-frequency radios and satellite data links to communicate with air traffic control. Harlan had spent the last hour in a state of relaxed negligence. He had his feet propped up on the footrests beneath the rudder pedals, a violation of company policy during oceanic crossings, and was casually scrolling through a magazine on his personal tablet. He hadn't spoken a word to Elena since sending his vindictive message. Elena, on the other hand, was the picture of vigilant professionalism. She sat upright, monitoring the flight instruments, cross-checking their fuel burn against the flight plan, and listening attentively to the static-laced HF radio. She was also keeping a very close eye on the engine indicating and crew alerting system display. The minor bleed air advisory that Harlan had dismissed on the ground had not magically resolved itself. In fact, Elena had noticed subtle fluctuations in the cabin pressurization metrics over the last portion of the flight. The Boeing 777 is a magnificent piece of engineering, designed with multiple redundancies. But when an inboard fault compounds with atmospheric pressure changes, those redundancies can quickly unravel. "Captain," Elena said, breaking the long silence. Her voice was calm, but carried a distinct edge of urgency. "I'm seeing a steady increase in the cabin altitude rate of climb. The pressurization controller is struggling to maintain the schedule. The duct pressure on the right engine bleed system is fluctuating wildly." Harlan let out an exasperated sigh, not looking up from his magazine. "It's just the automatic controller hunting for the right valve position, Langford. Stop babysitting the dials. It's a heavy jet. It breathes." "It's not hunting, Captain. It's failing," Elena corrected, pointing a slender finger at the screen. "The advisory we had on the ground for the right engine bleed valve. The valve is sticking. It's dumping compressed air before it reaches the packs to pressurize the cabin." "I told you on the ground the system is redundant," Harlan snapped, finally tossing his tablet onto his flight bag. He leaned forward, squinting at the screen. "The left engine bleed is picking up the slack. We're fine." Just as the words left his mouth, a loud synthetic chime echoed through the flight deck. A bright yellow master caution light illuminated on the glare shield directly in front of both pilots. On the EICAS screen, a new message flashed in stark yellow text. "Bleed, leak arrogance." Simultaneously, the cabin rate of climb indicator spiked. They were losing pressurization. "Right engine bleed leak," Elena announced immediately, reaching for the quick reference handbook. "I have the QRH bleed leak right engine checklist. Step 1, right engine, bleed air switch off." Hold on! Harlan barked, his hands hovering over the overhead panel. His face suddenly flushed with a mixture of adrenaline and panic. "If we shut off the right bleed, we're relying entirely on the left pack to keep us pressurized. If that fails, we're doing an emergency descent into the middle of the ocean." "Captain, the checklist is not optional," Elena stated, her eyes locked on his. "A bleed leak means high-temperature air is currently venting uncontrollably into the engine strut or wing leading edge. It poses a severe fire hazard and structural risk. Step 1, right engine. Bleed air switch off." Harlan hesitated. The arrogance that had defined his entire persona evaporated, replaced by a sudden, paralyzing indecision. He was used to textbook flights. He hadn't faced a genuine cascading mechanical failure in years, and his complacency had dulled his instincts. He stared at the overhead panel, his hand shaking slightly as he reached for the switch, second-guessing the procedure. "Harlan, execute the checklist," Elena commanded. The captain honorific was gone. The shift in her tone was so abrupt, so saturated with absolute, unyielding authority, that Harlan physically flinched. He flipped the right bleed air switch to the off position. "Switch off," he muttered, his breathing growing shallow. "Right pack switch off," Elena continued, reading the QRH with the speed and precision of a metronome. Harlan flipped the pack switch. For a terrifying few seconds, the cockpit was silent, save for the rush of wind outside. But the situation was not stabilizing. The master warning alarm, a piercing, continuous wail, suddenly shattered the quiet. The entire cockpit bathed in flashing red light. Cabin altitude flashed in bold red letters on the screen. The single remaining air conditioning pack on the left engine could not keep up with the volume of the 777's massive cabin. The pressure was dropping too fast. "Cabin altitude is passing 10,000 feet, Elena called out, her voice cutting through the blaring alarm. The automated warning system began to scream, a computerized voice. "Cabin altitude! Cabin altitude!" In the passenger cabin behind them, rubber masks were automatically dropping from the ceiling, unleashing a wave of panic among the hundreds of souls on board. "Oxygen masks on," Elena ordered. She grabbed her quick-donning oxygen mask, squeezing the red release tabs, and snapped it over her face in seconds. She flipped the toggle switch on her audio panel to route her microphone through the mask. Harlan was fumbling. His hands, thick and clumsy with sudden panic, struggled with the straps of his mask. He dropped it onto his lap, cursing loudly before finally wrestling it onto his face. His eyes were wide with terror. He looked at Elena, completely overwhelmed. The king of the cockpit was frozen. I have control," Harlan stammered through his mask, but his hands were trembling on the yoke, inadvertently disengaging the autopilot with a harsh sound. The heavy jet pitched up, slightly losing speed. "Negative?" Elena's voice boomed through the intercom system, crystal clear and chillingly composed. "You are incapacitated by task saturation. I have the aircraft." Elena didn't wait for his permission. She slammed her hands onto her control yoke and depressed the autopilot override button. She pushed the nose of the Boeing 777 down, arresting the dangerous loss of airspeed Harlan had just caused. "My aircraft," Elena repeated forcefully. Harlan let go of his yoke as if it were electrified, sinking back into his seat, his chest heaving under his safety harness. He was completely out of his depth, and they both knew it. Elena's hands moved in a blur of practiced, methodical action. She deployed the speed brakes to create drag and set the thrust levers to idle. "Gander Center, Global Flight Heavy. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday." Elena broadcasted over the emergency frequency, her breathing steady and controlled beneath the mask. "Rapid depressurization. Initiating emergency descent to flight level 100. We are deviating 15 miles right of track. Global Flight Heavy, Gander Center. Mayday received." The Canadian controller responded instantly, prioritizing their crisis. "Descend at pilot's discretion to flight level 100. Altimeter 2985. You have the airspace." The massive Boeing 777 pitched down into a steep, controlled dive. The sky outside the windows shifted as they plummeted toward the cloud deck below. Elena flew the aircraft with mathematical precision, managing the airspeed perfectly to balance the fastest possible descent without overstressing the airframe. She glanced over at Harlan. He was gripping his armrests, his eyes glued to the artificial horizon, hyperventilating into his oxygen mask. The man who had mocked her experience just an hour prior was now a passenger in his own flight deck. "Harlan," Elena said sharply through the intercom, "pull yourself together. Run the passenger oxygen switch to on. to ensure positive flow to the cabin and advise the flight attendants to secure themselves. It took Harlan several seconds to register the command. He shakily reached up, flipping the passenger oxygen switch. He picked up the PA handset, but his hand was trembling so violently he dropped it. Elena sighed, a sharp digital burst of static over the radio. She reached over, grabbed the handset, and pressed the PA button. "Attention flight attendants, this is the flight deck. Secure yourselves immediately. Passengers, remain seated with your masks securely fastened. We are performing a controlled descent to a safer altitude. We have the situation managed." Her voice ringing through the cabin wasn't the frantic bark of a panicked pilot. It was the soothing, ironclad assurance of someone who was in absolute command of the sky. The Boeing 777 leveled off at 10,000 feet, the dense lower atmosphere, providing enough breathable oxygen so the crew and passengers could safely remove their masks. Elena re-engaged the autopilot, adjusting the thrust levers to maintain a steady cruising speed. The piercing alarms had been silenced, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic breathing of Captain Harlan Brooks. Elena pulled her oxygen mask off and let it hang from its hook. She smoothed her hair, her expression unreadable. She turned to Harlan, who was slowly peeling his mask away, his face pale and covered in a sheen of cold sweat. "The aircraft is stable at 10,000 feet, Elena reported cleanly, as if she were reading a grocery list rather than concluding a harrowing emergency descent. "Pressurization is equalized. Both engines are running, but the right bleed is isolated. We cannot continue to London unpressurized at this altitude. We don't have the fuel." Harlan swallowed hard, trying to regain a sliver of his shattered ego. He sat up straighter, wiping his forehead with the back of his sleeve. Right, of course. Good descent, Langford. But I'm taking the aircraft back now. My controls." He reached for the yoke. "Negative," Elena said, her hand resting firmly on the center console, blocking his access to the thrust levers. "You surrendered control when you froze during a critical emergency phase. You disengaged the autopilot and induced a pitch-up attitude during a depressurization event. I am acting pilot in command for the remainder of this flight." Harlan's face flushed dark red, anger rapidly replacing his fear. "Listen to me, you little upstart. I am the captain of this vessel. You are a first officer. I panicked for a second. It happens to everyone. Now give me back my airplane before I have you arrested for mutiny when we land." Elena didn't blink. She reached into her flight bag, pulling out her leather-bound notebook. "It doesn't happen to everyone, Harlan. It happens to complacent pilots who ignore safety advisories on the ground and fail to maintain situational awareness in the air. We are diverting to Halifax Stanfield International Airport. It's 80 miles off our nose." "We are not going to Halifax!" Harlan shouted, slamming his fist onto the glare shield. "We are turning around and going back to Boston, or JFK. Global Continental has maintenance bases there. If we land in Halifax, we strand a 777 in Canada, and corporate will have my head." "Corporate will not be your primary concern," Elena replied coolly. She keyed the radio. "Gander Center, Global Flight Heavy. We are stable at 10,000 feet, requesting immediate vectors for an emergency diversion to Halifax. Global Flight Heavy, cleared direct to Halifax. Contact Halifax approach on 119.2. Good luck, flight." Harlan unbuckled his harness, leaning aggressively toward Elena. "I am ordering you to turn this plane to Boston. You do not have the authority to make this decision. I will ruin your career, Langford. I will make sure you never see the inside of a cockpit again." Elena finished typing the approach coordinates into the flight computer. She slowly turned in her seat to face Harlan. The air in the cockpit grew freezing cold, despite the heating system. "Harlan," Elena said softly, but the sheer gravity of her voice made both Harlan and the chief purser, who had just entered the flight deck, freeze. "Sit down, buckle your harness, and do not touch a single instrument on my flight deck." "Your flight deck?" Harlan spat, a bitter, desperate laugh escaping his lips. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Elena reached into the breast pocket of her crisp white uniform shirt. She didn't pull out a company ID. She pulled out a solid brass badge housed in a black leather wallet and flipped it open. The federal seal of the United States Department of Transportation gleamed in the dim light. "I am Elena Langford, Chief Flight Examiner for the Federal Aviation Administration Eastern Region," she said, watching the blood completely drain from Harlan's face. "I am here conducting an undercover line check on your performance, Captain Brooks. A performance that has resulted in 3 critical safety violations, gross insubordination to standard operating procedures, and a total loss of aircraft control during a Mayday emergency." Harlan fell back into his seat, as if he had been shot. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The badge caught the light, a heavy, undeniable symbol of absolute authority. "Furthermore," Elena continued, her eyes pinning him to his seat, "as a federal evaluator, I have the statutory authority to suspend a pilot certificate in the air if I deem them an immediate threat to aviation safety. Consider your airline transport pilot certificate suspended, Mr. Brooks. You are now a passenger in the jump seat. If you interfere with my operation of this aircraft, I will have the Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrest you upon our arrival in Halifax for interfering with a flight crew." The chief purser covered her mouth, her eyes wide with shock, before a slow, undeniable smile crept across her face. "I'll go check on that passenger, Captain Langford," she said, intentionally emphasizing the title. She stepped out and locked the door behind her. Harlan sat in the left seat, a broken man. He stared blankly at the instruments, the realization of his ruined career crashing down on him with the weight of the 777. 3 weeks later, the atmosphere inside Conference Room A at the Federal Aviation Administration's regional headquarters was stifling. The long mahogany table was surrounded by the highest-ranking officials in commercial aviation: the FAA Regional Director, Global Continental's VP of Flight Operations, the Chief Pilot, and union representatives. Harlan Brooks sat at the far end of the table wearing a rumpled gray suit. He looked a decade older, the arrogance completely hollowed out of him. Across from him sat Elena Langford, dressed in her crisp, immaculate captain's uniform. "Director," the chief pilot said, his voice tight with fury, "we have reviewed the cockpit voice recorder transcripts, the flight data recorder telemetry, and the sworn testimony of Chief Examiner Langford, the chief purser, and Halifax Air Traffic Control." The director flipped a page in the thick binder of evidence. "Your union representative has argued that your temporary incapacitation during the depressurization event was a medically induced panic attack, and that your decades of unblemished service should warrant a suspension and retraining rather than a revocation of your air transport pilot certificate." Harlan nodded weakly, looking down at his hands. "Director," I froze. It was a momentary lapse, but I have decades of hours in the sky. I know how to fly. Ow. "Knowing how to fly an airplane in perfect weather is not why we pay captains substantial salaries," the chief pilot interrupted. "We pay captains to manage disasters. You didn't manage it. You created it." "Furthermore," the director continued, pulling out a printed sheet of paper, "we have the ACARS transmission you sent at flight level 220. Harlan closed his eyes. The digital death warrant. The director read the message aloud to the silent room. "My F.O. Langford is dangerously inexperienced. It is obvious she is a diversity quota hire. Her presence compromises the safety of my flight deck." The director dropped the paper onto the table in disgust. "Mr. Brooks, you transmitted a hostile, prejudiced, and wildly inaccurate message regarding an FAA chief examiner on an open company network, while you were supposed to be monitoring an active flight profile. You induced a hostile work environment that explicitly destroyed crew resource management, the very foundation of modern aviation safety. Elena leaned forward, resting her hands on the mahogany table. "Harlan," she said, her voice commanding the immediate attention of everyone in the room. "You claimed you didn't know me, but I know you." Harlan looked up, confused. "Years earlier, I was a junior first officer flying right seat on a 737 out of Newark," Elena continued, her eyes locking onto his. "We were flying through a severe winter storm. I pointed out ice accumulation on the wings during taxi and requested a secondary de-icing. You told me to shut my mouth, told me I was a quota hire who didn't understand winter operations, and you attempted to take off. I had to physically block the thrust levers and call ground control to force us back to the pad." Harlan's face went chalk white as the memory suddenly surfaced. "You used your seniority to have me quietly transferred to another fleet the next day, burying the incident report," Elena said coldly. "But I didn't quit. I studied. I trained. I became a test pilot. I became an examiner. I made it my life's mission to ensure that pilots with your toxic, dangerous mentality were systematically removed from the sky before you killed somebody." The silence in the conference room was absolute. "Harlan Brooks," the director said, signing the document in front of him with a heavy stroke of his pen. "Effective immediately, your airline transport pilot certificate is permanently revoked. You are barred from holding any commercial flying license within the jurisdiction of the Federal Aviation Administration. Global Continental Airlines is formally terminating your employment effective today." Harlan didn't say a word. He stood up slowly, the weight of his shattered legacy crushing his shoulders, and walked out of the room, leaving his career behind in the dust. Later that evening, Elena Langford stood at the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of O'Hare's Terminal 3, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. A Boeing 777 was pushing back from the gate, its anti-collision lights flashing rhythmically against the twilight. The industry was changing. The old guard, the cowboys of the sky who ruled with fear and prejudice, were being grounded. The flight deck was no longer a dictatorship. It was a place for professionals, for teamwork, and for absolute, uncompromising excellence. Elena smiled, checking her watch. She picked up her rolling flight bag. She had a flight to command to Tokyo, and she was looking forward to meeting her new first officer. The sky belongs to those who respect it. And Captain Elena Langford proved that true leadership isn't about arrogance. It's about absolute competence when the alarms start blaring. Harlan Brooks learned the hard way that prejudice and complacency are the deadliest combinations in aviation, and karma flies at 35,000 feet. If you were on the edge of your seat during this intense, mid-air drama and want more thrilling, real-life aviation stories and workplace justice, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable stories.